My name is Kate Hale. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the keeper of Silvercrest Vineyard, a stretch of sun, soil, and memory my late husband and I built with our bare hands. I used to think nothing could shake the peace of this land. But that belief ended the afternoon my son got married under our own vines. If you've ever wondered how quickly love can turn into public shame, stay with me. This isn't just about betrayal. It's about what a mother does when her own child asks for the one thing she cannot give. It was early summer. The air smelled of lavender and fermenting grapes, that familiar sweetness that clung to everything at Silvercrest. Rows of chairs faced the arbor we'd woven with vines years ago. Guests in pale linen laughed over champagne. Lanterns hung from cedar posts swayed in the breeze. I stood near the edge of it all, wearing the same brooch my husband gave me when we opened our first harvest. I told myself this day belonged to my son, Dan, and his new wife, Sophia. Sophia's family had flown in from California, their confidence shining through every polished gesture. Her father, Alessandro, shook hands like he was sealing a business deal. I smiled politely, but inside, I felt a quiet distance. There was something rehearsed about the way everyone looked at me, as if I were a guest in my own vineyard. During the toasts, Sophia rose first. Her voice carried the kind of charm that photographs well. "To family," she said, raising her glass, "and to the next chapter of Silvercrest, which we hope will continue to thrive. Together." The pause before that last word wasn't accidental. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Then Dan stood beside her. His tie was slightly crooked, his face a little flushed. I saw the boy who once ran through the vines barefoot, chasing the dog. But his eyes were restless. He cleared his throat, tapped the microphone, and said, "Mom, there's something we've been meaning to ask you. In fact, I think today's the perfect day." The music softened. Guests turned toward me, smiling as if expecting a sweet family surprise. Dan reached into his jacket and pulled out a document folded in thirds. "It's the deed, Mom. The vineyard. You always said it would be mine one day, and, well, Sophia and I would like to start our life here. Could you make it official? Today?" My hands went cold. He was smiling, but his voice trembled beneath the performance. I felt every eye on me, waiting. I said gently, "Dan, that's not something to discuss right now." Sophia slipped her hand through his arm. "It's just a signature, Mrs. Hale. A symbolic gesture." Her tone was smooth as glass, practiced. A way to honor family unity. The laughter that followed was uneasy. I could sense Alessandro watching, calculating. I looked at Dan. "A vineyard isn't a symbol," I said quietly. "It's work. It's years of storms and taxes and dawns you don't sleep through. You're not ready for it." For a heartbeat, silence covered the crowd. Then Dan's jaw tightened. "You don't trust me." His voice cracked into something raw. "After everything, you still think I'll ruin it." I didn't move. "I think you're asking on the wrong day." And then it happened. Fast, loud, unbelievable. His hand came across my face before I even registered he'd raised it. The sound cut through the music, through the birdsong, through the years that had built us. My brooch hit the ground, the pearls scattering in the dust. No one spoke. The clinking glasses stopped. I bent down, picked up the brooch, and fixed the pin with hands that did not tremble. My voice came out steady. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Hale." I turned and walked toward the car waiting by the gate. Behind me, the silence felt heavier than any accusation. I heard Sophia whisper his name once, softly. Inside the car, the leather was warm against my palms. My cheeks still burned. I could see the vineyard in the rearview mirror, the guests frozen like a painting. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button on my phone. "Victor," I said when the line clicked. "Bring the cedar folder and call Agent Elias. You have 1 hour." The sun was setting when I drove away from Silvercrest, the lanterns swaying behind me like small, quiet witnesses. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I only repeated one thought to myself. Silence isn't surrender. It's design. By the time Victor arrived, the sun had dropped behind the hills and the air had turned cold. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, the ceramic holding more comfort than the liquid inside. The sound of gravel under his tires broke the stillness. His old sedan came to a stop near the cedar trees Edward had planted decades ago. Victor Ames stepped out carrying a brown leather case. He didn't speak right away, just studied my face, reading the story I hadn't yet told. "I saw the video," he finally said. "Someone posted a clip before it was taken down." "I figured as much," I replied, my voice steady. "Did you bring it?" He nodded and placed a cedar folder on the table between us. The smell of it, wood, dust, faint traces of Edward's cologne, rose into the air. My husband had used that folder for every major document in his life: the mortgage, the first vineyard license, even the birth certificate of our son. It was more than paper. It was memory carved into fiber. Victor opened the folder carefully. Inside was a thick envelope sealed in gold wax and a smaller flash drive labeled in Edward's handwriting. Clause Addendum. He unfolded the legal document, his glasses catching the porch light. "Edward added this amendment 2 years before he passed," Victor said. "He called it the dual signature clause. It means any transfer of Silvercrest requires not only your signature but also verification from a designated witness under specific conditions. If any coercion is detected, emotional, financial, or physical, the entire transfer is void." I listened quietly, watching the flicker of the porch lantern. "He thought ahead," I said softly. "He always did," Victor replied. He handed me the document. "But there's a catch. The clause is airtight on paper, yet it depends on evidence. If Dan's camp argues you're not of sound mind, or that this amendment was altered posthumously, we could face a long battle." I traced my finger along Edward's signature. The ink had faded slightly, but the loops and pressure were unmistakable. "He signed this after his last heart attack," I murmured. "He told me one day I might need protection not from strangers, but from family." Victor took a small recorder from his case. "He left a message for you, too." He pressed play. Edward's voice filled the night, roughened by illness but still calm. "Katie, if they ever make you doubt yourself, remember who you are. The vines only survive because they're cut back each season. Pruning doesn't mean loss. It means control." The message ended with a soft click. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of his voice settle in my chest like a heartbeat that still echoed. Victor leaned back in his chair. "We'll need to verify every signature, every timestamp, every witness. If Alessandro or Sophia try to fabricate ownership, we'll expose them through the notary chain. But you have to be ready, Kate. It's going to get ugly." "I've seen ugly," I said quietly. "It looks a lot like silence after a slap." He looked at me for a long moment. "Then we start tonight. I'll file the preliminary notice of protection. Eddie will handle the banking trail. We'll need to secure every piece of correspondence you've had with Dan over the past 3 years." I nodded. then picked up the cedar folder, feeling its weight settle into my hands. "I'm not fighting them for the money," I said. "I'm fighting for the truth of what Edward built, for what he believed this place meant." Victor smiled faintly. "He once told me you'd outthink any man in a courtroom if you ever cared enough to step inside one." "I don't plan to shout," I said. "I plan to prove." The porch light flickered as a breeze passed through the vines, carrying the faint scent of earth and lavender. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked, the sound echoing off the stone walls. I stood, holding the folder close. Inside that cedar casing was more than paper. It was Edward's foresight, my resolve, and the quiet shield I'd need for the storm ahead. "Victor," I said softly, "tomorrow, start tracing the signatures. If they've touched a single document, I want to know when, where, and how." He closed his case and nodded. "They wanted the deed," he said, almost to himself. "They just forgot it still, breathes in ink and time." As his car rolled down the drive, I stood watching the vineyard fade into darkness, each row a line of shadows standing guard. I ran my thumb along the clasp of the cedar folder and whispered into the night, "All right, Edward, let's prune what needs pruning." I woke before dawn, long before the vineyard came alive. The house was still, wrapped in the kind of silence that presses against the walls. I made coffee, black and strong, and sat at the kitchen table where Edward used to balance the ledgers. His handwriting still marked the corners of old receipts, neat, deliberate, full of patience. Victor had sent over a drive with copies of every bank transfer I'd made to Dan during the past 8 years. There were more than I remembered. College loans, a down payment for his business, medical bills, a car that was supposed to be temporary. Every transaction was labeled help. But the truth stared back at me. Help had turned into habit. At 7, Eddie Rowan arrived carrying his usual travel mug and a folder thick with papers. He was younger than Victor, sharper in movement, with eyes that missed nothing. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said, setting his folder down. "Victor told me to start building the timeline." "Good," I said, pouring him a cup. "I've got records, but I want the truth, not sympathy." He smiled. "You'll get both, probably in that order." We spent the next few hours going through every statement, every deposit, every check I'd signed. Eddie highlighted a pattern: transfers from my account into one shared between Dan and Sophia's company. The amounts were small at first, then doubled, then tripled. "See this?" he said, tapping a date. "They moved your money through a secondary account 2 days after you sent it. Looks like it was used for an investment fund that doesn't exist anymore." "Was it Sophia's doing?" I asked quietly. "Her name's on the access record," he said, flipping the page. "But I'd bet Alessandro's fingerprints are somewhere behind it. He's got a history of shell companies under relatives' names." I felt a strange calm settle over me. Anger had burned itself out. Now there was only focus. I wrote down every date, every amount, every note. Each line was a reminder that this wasn't about one slap. It was a pattern of erosion. Eddie took out his camera and began photographing each document for evidence. "Victor said to tell you we'll need copies notarized this week. He's filing an affidavit under the Elder Financial Protection Statute." "Edward warned me about pride," I murmured. "He said it's like frost. It starts invisible and kills from the root up." Eddie paused, watching me. "He sounds like a man who saw too much truth too soon." "He was," I said. "But he never stopped believing people could come back from it." When Eddie stepped outside to take a call, I opened the cedar folder again. Inside the pocket where the amendment had been was something I hadn't noticed before. A small Polaroid photo, faded around the edges. It showed Edward and a very young Dan, both barefoot in the soil, planting a vine together. Edward had written on the back, "Our beginning. His roots will remember." The photograph trembled slightly in my hand. It was so long ago, back when Dan's laughter carried across the rows and his hands were blistered from helping us prune. For a moment, I saw not the man from the wedding, but the boy who used to leave grape stains on the kitchen floor. Eddie returned, tucking his phone away. That was Victor. He found something. Sophia accessed a safe deposit box in her maiden name last week. He thinks it might contain backup documents, or forged ones. Let her use it, I said. Let her think she's winning. He raised an eyebrow. That's risky. So is planting vines in rocky soil, I said, setting the Polaroid on the table. But that's how you find out which ones survive. He nodded, understanding the tone beneath my words. We'll shadow her quietly. If she moves any files, I'll document it. I gathered the receipts into neat piles, sliding them into a new binder. Everything in order, I said, half to myself. That's all Edward ever wanted. Eddie lingered at the door before leaving. You know, Mrs. Hale, he said, most people panic when money's stolen. You're the first person I've seen who looks calmer the more she finds. I smiled faintly. That's because money was never the thing I lost. When the door closed, I sat there for a long time, staring at the Polaroid in the soft morning light. Outside, the vineyard was waking up. The hum of irrigation, the low buzz of bees. I slipped the photo back into the cedar folder and closed the clasp. Sometimes, silence isn't absence, it's preparation. The wedding invitation had arrived weeks before the day itself, printed on thick ivory paper with gold lettering that seemed to glow under the morning light. Together with their families, it began. Sophia Morante and Daniel Hale request the honor of your presence. I remember tracing my finger over those words, pausing at the phrase, their families. It was elegant, expensive, and strangely hollow. Joan Burke, my neighbor, and the only person who knew the full story, had been sitting with me on the porch when it came. She poured tea and read the invitation twice before saying what we were both thinking. You don't have to go, Kate, she said. They're setting the stage, and you don't owe them your attendance. I know, I answered. But sometimes you have to walk into the theater to see who's playing which role. Joan frowned. He's your son, not your opponent. Both can be true, I said quietly. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of floral arrangements, vendor calls, and the odd silence that comes from being left out of decisions that once revolved around you. Sophia's name appeared in every email thread, every checklist. Mine appeared nowhere. The vineyard staff told me Alessandro had been there twice, pacing the rows, discussing future plans with contractors. Victor told me not to attend. They're baiting you, he said. They'll provoke a reaction, get it on camera, use it later. And if I don't go, I asked, what happens? They'll say you refused to bless them. They'll rewrite the story. That night, I walked the vineyard alone, lantern in hand, the light shifting over the vines like ripples of old memory. Edward used to say vines listen to us, that they carry our intentions as much as our care. I wondered what they'd hear in me that night. Anger, fear, or simply fatigue. I decided then, I would go. Not to bless them, not to fight them, but to watch. Observation can be a form of armor when words no longer matter. The morning of the wedding, the vineyard looked like something from a magazine. White chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, musicians tuning violins under a canopy of linen, photographers rehearsing their angles. Marco Delaney, the hired photographer, was a young man with tired eyes and an honest posture. He greeted me politely, not realizing he'd soon hold more truth in his lens than he intended. Sophia floated through the crowd, every gesture rehearsed. She had that effortless kind of charm people mistake for kindness. When she saw me, she smiled, her eyes scanning my dress, my jewelry, my composure. "Mrs. Hale," she said, taking my hands lightly, "I'm so glad you came. It means everything to Dan." I returned the smile, steady and quiet. "It's your day. I wouldn't want to spoil it." She tilted her head, as if testing the sincerity in my tone. "Of course not." As guests arrived, I could feel the tension under the laughter, the polite exchanges, the orchestrated joy. Alessandro moved like a man in control of every narrative, his cigar smoke curling into the sunlight. I watched him whisper to the wedding planner, then to Sophia, his gaze flicking toward me. During the rehearsal dinner the night before, I'd overheard fragments of their plan while walking past the old barn. Sophia's voice, soft but sharp, carried through the open doors. "It has to look natural," she'd said. "We'll talk about the vineyard during the toast. He'll ask for the deed. She won't refuse in front of everyone." Alessandro had replied, "She's proud, but not reckless. Play the family card. If she hesitates, Dan pushes a little. Public emotion works in our favor." That was the moment I decided to let the show play out exactly as they had rehearsed it. I wanted them to believe they were directing the script. Now, as I stood beneath the arbor, I could almost hear Edward's voice in the back of my mind. "Let them think. They're leading, Katie. The vine bends before it grows stronger." When Dan and Sophia exchanged vows, I felt an ache that wasn't jealousy or anger. It was grief for the simplicity that used to exist between us. He looked handsome, uncertain, and already caught between love and guilt. After the ceremony, as champagne flowed and music filled the air, I caught a glimpse of Marco's camera turning my way. Through his lens, I saw what he saw, a mother smiling faintly, unaware, or pretending not to be aware, of the storm about to break. Later, I learned that Marco had recorded something he hadn't meant to. As he adjusted his audio, he'd captured a whisper between Dan and Sophia, her voice low, but cutting through the music. "She'll sign. Just wait. If she refuses, make her look ungrateful." It was all there, sealed inside that tiny piece of technology, waiting for its moment to surface. When the music swelled and glasses clinked, I took one last look at the rows of vines glowing in the late afternoon sun. I had planted them once with love. That day, I was planting something else: silence, patience, and a seed of truth that would take root in time. The sound of the crowd behind me faded as soon as I shut the car door. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breath, sharp and uneven. The slap had left a warmth on my cheek that felt like fire trapped under skin. I turned the key, and the engine hummed to life, steady and low, like it knew I needed calm. The clock on the dashboard read 6:42 p.m. The light was turning gold, spilling across the steering wheel, catching the dust still clinging to my palms. I stared at that clock, watching the second hand move, steady and unforgiving. Each tick felt like a heartbeat in slow motion. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. Victor's number was already in my favorites. When he answered, I didn't waste a second. "Victor, it's me," I said, my voice lower than I expected. "Bring the cedar folder and contact Agent Elias. You have 1 hour." He didn't ask what had happened. He just said, "I'll be there." I ended the call and sat back, my hands gripping the wheel. Outside, laughter drifted faintly from the vineyard, the kind that tries too hard to fill silence. I could picture Sophia smoothing her hair, whispering explanations to guests. Dan would be pacing, torn between apology and pride. And Alessandro, I was sure, would already be planning the narrative. The emotional misunderstanding, the aging mother's refusal, the tragic tension. They'd call it family drama. I called it exposure. The air inside the car smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet Lucas had made for me last summer. I reached up and touched it, the little fabric pouch still tied to the mirror. My grandson's handwriting was crooked on the tag. For Grandma's safe drives. That simple gesture steadied me. My hand stopped shaking. I opened the glove compartment and took out a small notebook I always kept there. On the first page, in Edward's handwriting, was a quote he'd written the year we'd bought Silvercrest. "If they corner you, don't fight the shadow, move toward the light." That was exactly what I intended to do. As I sat there, I noticed movement in the rearview mirror, a sleek black car parked across the road. Alessandro's driver. He'd been following the entire time. The window rolled down slightly, and a flash of a camera lens caught the fading light. They were still documenting, still controlling the narrative. I turned my head deliberately and met the lens with a calm stare. Then I started the car and drove down the gravel road. Each turn deliberate, each mile away from the vineyard another layer of detachment peeling off my skin. Halfway home, the phone rang again. Victor's voice was brisk but steady. "I reached Elias. He's on standby. There's something else you should know. Eddie just called. Someone tried to access a duplicate of the deed from the county records this afternoon." My grip on the wheel tightened. "Who?" The request came through an intermediary under Sophia's maiden name. They probably thought they could file a new ownership claim while you were occupied with the ceremony. The clerk flagged it and called Eddie right away. I exhaled slowly. "Let them think it worked," I said. "Let them move the pieces first." "That's risky, Kate." "It's necessary," I replied. "If you catch a thief mid-reach, they claim confusion. But if you wait until their hands are full, they can't drop the evidence." Victor was silent for a moment. "Understood. We'll document everything. I'll have Eddie trace the IP logs and pull the bank access reports." I nodded to myself, watching the road wind through the hills. "And Victor, make sure you record every step. I want no pity, only proof." When the call ended, the sky was burning orange, the last of the daylight catching on the vineyard signs as I passed them. I slowed when I reached the final bend. From that spot, I could still see the faint glow of the lanterns back at Silvercrest, tiny specks of light that had once meant celebration. Now, they looked like distant fires from a field I no longer owned. Though legally, it was still mine. I pulled over and let the engine idle. The vineyard stretched out below like a painting, rows of green running into the horizon, soft wind bending them into waves. I whispered to the hills, to the soil Edward had loved, "I'm not giving you up." Somewhere, a phone camera clicked again. Maybe the driver was still watching. Maybe Sophia wanted another picture to twist into her version of the story. It didn't matter. Every image they captured from that point forward would belong to my truth, not theirs. I turned the car back toward town. Each turn of the wheels felt like a countdown. By the time I reached home, it was 7:15. The porch light flickered on automatically, washing the driveway in soft amber. I parked, sat in silence, and stared at the house that had outlasted storms, debts, and now betrayal. The cedar folder was waiting inside, ready to become my weapon, and I, for the first time in years, felt no fear in holding it. When I returned to Silvercrest the next morning, the air was already heavy with gossip. News spreads quickly in small towns, and a slap at a Vineyard wedding travels faster than any headline. The gate stood half open, the private property sign swaying slightly in the wind. I parked outside, watching the white tents from a distance. The celebration had ended, but the stage was still there, like a ghost refusing to leave. Victor's car arrived minutes later, followed by a black SUV. Agent Elias stepped out first, tall and precise, his badge glinting against the early sun. He gave me a nod, the kind that carried both professionalism and understanding. "We received the documents," he said. "Mr. Ames briefed me last night. Is everyone here?" "They will be," I said. "They're not finished playing their roles." We didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, Sophia's silver coupe rolled up the driveway, Dan behind the wheel. His face was pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but Sophia looked immaculate, her hair perfect, sunglasses covering half her face. Behind them came Alessandro, stepping out with the slow arrogance of a man who thought the world bent to his schedule. I stayed near the porch as they approached. Sophia's tone was light but edged. "Mrs. Hale, we thought we should clear up last night's misunderstanding before the press makes a circus of it." "There's nothing to clear up," I replied calmly. "But you're welcome to wait for my attorney." Her smile froze for a fraction of a second. "Your attorney?" Victor emerged from the house just then, carrying the cedar folder. He didn't look at them right away, just adjusted his glasses, scanning the guests lingering at the end of the driveway. Then he opened the folder, revealing the gold-sealed document inside. "This is the original deed to Silvercrest Vineyard," he said evenly. "And this," he tapped a separate sheet, "is the dual signature amendment created and notarized by Edward Hale before his passing. Any transfer of this property requires both Mrs. Hale's voluntary consent and a certified witness verification. Any attempt to acquire ownership through coercion constitutes fraud under state law." Alessandro's expression flickered between disbelief and irritation. "You can't possibly think." But Victor cut him off. "We have documentation of an attempted duplicate deed request under Miss Morante's maiden name yesterday afternoon. We also have footage from the wedding photographer." Sophia turned sharply. "Footage?" That was when Marco Delaney stepped forward, clutching his camera bag. His face was pale, but his voice didn't shake. "I didn't mean to record it," he said, eyes darting toward me. "My mic was still on during the toast. It caught what you said before the ceremony." Elias took the camera gently, connecting it to a small device. Within seconds, Sophia's voice filled the air, clear, confident, and damning. "She'll sign, just wait. If she refuses, make her look ungrateful." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. Dan's eyes widened, and for a brief second, he looked at Sophia like he was seeing her for the first time. Alessandro's jaw tightened, but even he said nothing. Victor closed the folder and handed a document to Elias. "Here's the full report. We're filing for protective injunction and fraud investigation effective immediately." Elias turned to me. "Would you like to add anything, Mrs. Hale?" I met Sophia's gaze and said simply, "I told you once, this vineyard isn't a symbol. It's a life's work, and you tried to turn it into a trophy." Her lips trembled, though she forced a laugh. "You think this will make you look noble? You're ruining your own son's future." Dan stepped forward, his voice rough. Sophia, stop. She turned on him, startled. Dan. But he didn't let her finish. Just stop. His tone cracked, a mix of shame and something close to awakening. Elias handed Sophia a notice. Ms. Morante Hale, you'll receive a formal subpoena for questioning. Until then, you're advised not to contact Mrs. Hale or any member of her legal team. Alessandro muttered something in Italian under his breath, then took Sophia by the arm. They turned toward the gate, their departure as staged as their arrival. When the last car disappeared down the drive, Victor let out a slow breath. That, he said, wasn't just poetic timing. I looked out across the vineyard. The morning light caught on the dew, turning each vine into a thread of silver. It was necessary, I said. Sometimes the only way to restore order is to let people speak their own undoing. Elias checked his watch. We'll proceed with formal filings. You won't have to face them again until court. I nodded. Thank you. As Victor packed up the folder, he hesitated. You know this isn't over yet, he said gently. They'll fight. Hard. I know, I said, my eyes fixed on the rows of vines stretching into the distance. But for the first time, they'll be fighting on record and under light. When they left, I stayed by the gate, the same gate where Dan had once helped Edward hang the first family sign years ago. The paint had faded, the wood had aged, but the name still stood clear. Silvercrest. That day, it felt like more than a vineyard again. It felt like truth, reclaimed. The courthouse in Napa had always looked to me like a place where time moved differently, its high windows letting in light that never quite reached the corners, its old wooden benches polished by decades of waiting. I had been there only once before. Long ago, when Edward and I registered Silvercrest as our own. That day, the papers had felt light in my hands. This time, the air itself felt heavier. Victor was already there when I arrived, a stack of folders neatly arranged on the table. He looked up from his notes and smiled faintly. You made it early, he said. I couldn't sleep, I admitted. The vineyard hums even when I'm not there. He nodded, understanding what I meant. That's the mark of something truly yours. They can't take that part. Across the room, Sophia sat with her lawyer, dressed in black, her sunglasses perched on her head like armor. Dan sat a few seats away, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the floor. Alessandro wasn't present, but I could feel his influence in the expensive suit and cold efficiency of the defense attorney beside her. Reporters filled the hallway, their whispers blending with the low hum of air conditioning. They wanted spectacle, but what they'd get today was something quieter, something that didn't scream but still struck deep. Judge Dalton entered promptly at 9. His presence filled the room without needing to raise his voice. This hearing, he began, concerns the property known as Silvercrest Vineyard and allegations of attempted fraudulent transfer. Victor rose first. Your Honor, Mrs. Hale's late husband, Edward Hale, created a dual signature clause to prevent coercion or manipulation in the transfer of their property. We've provided the notarized amendment, verified handwriting samples, and evidence of an attempted duplicate deed request filed under a false name. The judge nodded. And the defense? Sophia's attorney stood, smooth and polished. Your Honor, my client contends that Mrs. Hale has recently shown signs of cognitive decline. There's concern that her late husband's documents may have been altered after his passing. We request a mental capacity evaluation before proceeding. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. I felt Victor's steadying hand on my arm, but I didn't look away from the attorney. I see, I said softly. And do they also plan to explain the safe deposit box under Ms. Morante's maiden name? That made the lawyer pause. He glanced at Sophia, who kept her expression carefully still. Judge Dalton turned to Victor. Do you have evidence of that claim? Victor opened a folder. Yes, Your Honor. Here is the access record, timestamped the day before the wedding, along with banking transactions connected to a newly formed LLC under Mr. Morante's oversight. We also have an audio file provided by the wedding photographer. At that, the defense attorney's tone shifted. An audio file? Recorded without consent? Elias, sitting quietly behind us, stood. The recording was incidental, not intentional. It captured statements relevant to the case and was obtained legally under California's one-party consent law. We verified its authenticity. The judge nodded. Play it. The clerk pressed a button and Sophia's voice filled the courtroom again. She'll sign. Just wait. If she refuses, make her look ungrateful. The silence afterward was the same kind that had fallen over the vineyard that day. Dense, immovable, absolute. Sophia looked down, her composure beginning to crack. Dan's eyes glistened with shame. Judge Dalton leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, would you like to make a statement? I stood slowly, my hands resting on the table to steady themselves. Your Honor, I'm not here to punish my son or his wife. I'm here because truth matters. My husband built that land with faith and honesty. To watch it turned into a transaction under false pretenses would dishonor everything he believed in. I've been silent because I was taught dignity doesn't need an audience. But silence shouldn't be mistaken for weakness. The judge's gaze softened slightly. Understood. The rest of the hearing unfolded like a storm breaking in slow motion. Victor presented the chain of custody for every document. Eddie's forensic report proved the ink on the forged deed was less than 3 months old. The notary log showed inconsistencies. Piece by piece, their web of deception came undone. When it was over, the judge spoke quietly. This court finds that Mrs. Hale remains the sole legal owner of Silvercrest Vineyard. The attempted transfer was invalid, and further investigation into financial misconduct will proceed. The gavel struck once, echoing through the room like a door closing on an old life. Sophia didn't look up. Her attorney gathered the papers quickly, whispering something I couldn't hear. Dan sat motionless for several seconds, then turned toward me. His eyes were red. Mom, he said softly, I'm sorry. I wanted to reach for him, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of something that might one day be rebuilt. Outside, the cameras flashed. Microphones reached forward. Mrs. Hale, how does it feel to win? One reporter shouted. I paused on the courthouse steps, the wind lifting my hair. This wasn't about winning, I said. It was about remembering who we are when someone tries to make us forget. Then I turned and walked toward Victor's car, the weight of the cedar folder under my arm, the warmth of Edward's words still echoing in my mind. Pruning doesn't mean loss. It means control. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally in control again. Within a week of the court hearing, my name was everywhere, not in the quiet corners of town where people still whispered sympathy, but in the spaces where strangers came to judge. Sophia had lost the case, yet somehow she managed to turn the story inside out. Articles appeared online calling me controlling, unstable, vindictive. A headline read, Elder heiress blocks her son's future. It spread fast, carried by gossip and money. The vineyard gates filled with cameras again, but this time they weren't celebrating a wedding. They were hunting for scandal. Joan came by one morning, her face tight with worry. "They're saying things that aren't true, Kate," she said, placing a newspaper on the table. "You shouldn't read this." "I already did," I answered. "Let them write what they need to. Words blow away faster than soil after harvest." She sighed. "Maybe so, but not everyone knows the soil like you do." I smiled faintly, though the truth was harder than I let on. The story stung. People I'd known for years started avoiding eye contact at the market. A few even asked, gently, if I was feeling all right, like I'd become something fragile. That word fragile stayed with me, echoing in the hallways of my house. Victor called every evening. "Stay calm," he said. "The smear will collapse on its own once the forensics are public." But calm felt distant. At night, I sat by the window with the cedar folder open on my lap. The vineyard looked peaceful under the moonlight, yet I knew storm clouds were forming in the shadows. Sophia wasn't done. Then, one afternoon, a courier arrived. He was polite, almost apologetic, handing me an envelope embossed with a silver crest. "From Mrs. Morante Hale," he said. Inside was a letter, short, cold, and manipulative. She wrote that if I cared about Dan, I would sign a mutual resolution agreement to transfer the vineyard under shared management. The document was tucked neatly beneath the letter, ready for my signature. The last line read, "Let's put an end to this bitterness before the press destroys what's left of our family." I stared at the papers for a long time. The pen sat on the table beside me, heavy with possibility. It would have been so easy to end the noise, to stop the eyes, the questions, the endless calls. The thought tempted me more than I wanted to admit. I picked up the pen, turned it in my hand, and imagined the ink tracing my name, the weight lifting from my shoulders. For a heartbeat, I almost believed it was Mercy. But then I saw the reflection in the window. Edward's old compass sitting on the sill, its needle pointing true north no matter how I turned it. He'd carried it through every decision, every storm. If they ever make you doubt yourself, remember who you are. My hand lowered the pen. The ink stayed dry. The phone rang just then. I let it go to voicemail, but when I played it back, the voice on the recording wasn't Sophia's. It was anonymous, distorted slightly by static. "Don't sign anything," it said. "She's not done lying. There's more. Watch for an envelope." I froze. The message ended abruptly. No name, no number, just silence. That evening, I walked to the porch with a cup of tea I didn't drink. The sunset spread gold across the vines, and the scent of lavender drifted through the air. For the first time since the trial, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle deep in my bones. Fighting for truth was noble until it turned into survival. Joan joined me without a word, setting her teacup down beside mine. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "I almost gave in," I admitted. "For a second, I thought peace was something you could sign for." She smiled softly. "Peace doesn't need a signature, Kate. Just time." The next morning, an unmarked envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single printed page. Emails between Sophia's PR team and a private investigator hired to fabricate my medical records. It was evidence of their smear campaign. The anonymous sender had underlined a single sentence: "Leak enough to ruin her credibility before court resumes." I called Victor immediately. When he saw the papers, his expression hardened. "This changes everything," he said. "We can subpoena her firm. Someone on the inside must have cracked." "Then maybe," I said. Truth still has a few friends left. That night, I didn't feel angry, just clear. The temptation to surrender had passed. What replaced it wasn't vengeance, it was resolve. I locked the false agreement back into the cedar folder, alongside the compass, and whispered, "You were right, Edward. Control isn't loud. It's quiet. And it's patient." The vineyard outside was still and dark, the kind of stillness that comes right before the first drop of rain. 3 days after the anonymous warning, Victor called me just after dawn. His tone was sharper than usual, clipped by urgency. "Kate," he said, "you should come to my office. Someone from Sophia's PR agency just walked in. You'll want to hear this in person." I arrived 20 minutes later, still in my field jacket, hair unbrushed from the morning wind. Victor was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, while a woman sat across from his desk. Mid-40s, tired eyes, the kind of fatigue that comes from keeping too many secrets for too long. Her name was Claire. "I was part of Sophia's campaign," she began quietly. "I handled the press releases, the social strategy. I wrote most of what's been circulating online about you." Her confession landed like a slow wave. She didn't look up as she spoke. "I thought it was just image work, damage control. But then I saw the forged medical documents and the emails about fabricating stories. That wasn't PR anymore. That was criminal." Victor stayed silent, letting her unravel at her own pace. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with tape. "Everything's in here. Emails, call logs, voice notes, the drafts that Alessandro approved himself, and payments wired through a shell account to keep me quiet." Her hands trembled as she slid it across the table. "I couldn't keep it anymore. You should have this." I studied her face, the remorse etched deep in every line. "Why now?" She hesitated. "My mother's in a care home. She doesn't know who I am half the time, but she still remembers fairness. Last night she told me, if you can put one wrong thing right before you die, it's worth the trouble. I guess this is mine." Victor broke the seal carefully, laying the contents across his desk. There were printouts of emails, bank transactions, and a USB drive marked Morante Internal. Eddie arrived moments later, carrying his laptop, and began scanning through the data. The evidence was worse than we imagined. Dates matched the smear timeline exactly. There were recorded calls between Sophia and Alessandro, strategizing how to manipulate public perception. And then, one file marked Plan B, Eddie clicked it open. The transcript appeared on screen. "If the court doesn't go our way, we'll announce that Mrs. Hale is transferring partial ownership to her son voluntarily. We'll leak it as reconciliation, then file quietly for full control after her passing. It's easier to steal from a legacy than from a living person." The room went still. Victor exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "This is enough to open a full investigation," he said. "Claire, we'll need your written statement and consent to turn this over to the court." She nodded. "Whatever it takes." When she left, I followed her outside. The sky was the pale gray of a storm that hadn't yet decided whether to break. "You'll be attacked for this," I said softly. "They'll call you disloyal." She smiled sadly. "They already did, long before I stopped helping them." Then she walked away, shoulders straight, as though confession itself had made her lighter. That evening, Victor filed the documents as part of an emergency discovery motion. Judge Dalton approved it within hours. The story shifted almost overnight. Reporters began quoting phrases from the leaks. Fabricated evidence, false claims, systemic deception. The tide that had once drowned me was now turning against them. Dan called the next morning. His voice was small, careful. "Mom, I saw the news. Is it true?" "Yes," I said. "They used your name too. You were the bait in their story." He didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice cracked. "I thought they were protecting me. I didn't know they were burying you." "Now you do," I said gently. "What you do with that truth will decide what kind of man you become." Later that day, Victor and Eddie came by the house. They found me in the garden, trimming the lavender. Eddie handed me another envelope, this one from the court clerk. Inside was the official acknowledgement of the new evidence, stamped and dated. It listed Sofia Morante Hale as the primary subject of inquiry, Alessandro as co-conspirator, and included a request for immediate asset freeze. Victor smiled for the first time in weeks. "You just changed the course of this case, Kate." I looked down at the lavender sprigs in my hand. "No," I said quietly. "Claire did. She just remembered what truth feels like." As the sun began to set, I placed the fresh court document inside the cedar folder, right beside Edward's amendment. The wood smelled faintly of sap and memory. For the first time since all of this began, the folder didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like restoration. That night, I lit the porch lantern and sat in its soft glow, watching the vineyard lights shimmer in the distance. Somewhere, justice was moving, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. And for the first time, I let myself believe it was coming home. The investigation that followed was methodical, slow, and merciless. Forensics never moves at the speed of emotion. It crawls, inch by inch, through every line of ink, every bite of data, until truth has nowhere left to hide. Eddie worked with a forensic analyst named Carla, a woman with quick eyes and the patience of stone. Together, they examined every document Sofia and Alessandro had filed in the past 6 months. They compared signatures, timestamps, and metadata, things most people never think about when they lie. I watched them from the side of Victor's office, the cedar folder open on the table like a quiet witness. Carla clicked through a series of magnified scans, pointing to subtle differences in the ink flow of the supposed deed transfer. "This pen stroke," she said, "is from a modern cartridge, manufactured this year. The original signature line was written with a fountain pen from the late 1990s. The texture's completely different." Victor leaned in. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone added this line after the document was notarized," Carla replied. "And based on the timestamp of the scanned copy, it happened 12 weeks ago." 12 weeks ago, the same week Sofia had visited the bank's safe deposit box. Eddie turned his laptop toward us. "And here's the digital trail. We've got her IP address logging into an encrypted drive on the same day. She uploaded scans of the fake deed and later exported them using a software watermark identical to the one used by Alessandro's company." Victor's jaw tightened. "That's direct evidence." Carla nodded. "The ink analysis, metadata trail, and cross-reference timestamps make this airtight. It's not just fraud, it's conspiracy." As they worked, I noticed Dan standing quietly by the window. He'd asked to come that morning, saying he needed to understand. His face looked older than his 38 years, like the months had added decades. He was pale, unshaven, and somewhere behind his exhaustion was shame that no one had forced him to carry. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said the documents were copies. She said it was just a way to speed things up before your lawyer interfered." "She lied," Victor said flatly. Dan nodded slowly. I know that now. He turned to me. I should have known earlier. I studied him for a moment. Knowing the truth late is still better than never knowing at all. He swallowed hard, looking at the photos Carla had laid out, the ink patterns, the metadata prints, the screenshots of Sophia's correspondence. I thought love meant loyalty, he said. But I think I confused loyalty with blindness. Loyalty without truth isn't love, I said gently. It's just surrender in disguise. Carla packed her files neatly, labeling each evidence folder. We'll submit these findings to the district attorney. Once verified, this case will move faster than they expect. Victor closed his notebook and turned to me. We're also filing an injunction to prevent further financial movement. The judge already froze 2 of Alessandro's accounts this morning. I nodded. And Sophia? Her assets are next, Victor said. But she's already trying to run a counter-campaign, claims the forensics were staged, that she's the victim of a vendetta. I let out a slow breath. A lie always needs an audience. The truth doesn't. Dan looked at me, eyes wet. Mom, I didn't see what she was doing. I wanted to believe she loved me. She probably did, I said softly, just not enough to love anything more than herself. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of Eddie's laptop. Outside, rain had started to fall, a thin drizzle streaking down the windows. It was the first rain in weeks. When Carla left, Eddie turned to Victor. We'll need to secure the originals tonight. If they've got someone inside the clerk's office, they might try to replace the scans again. Victor nodded. Do it, and send duplicates to Judge Dalton's chambers directly. Dan followed me outside after the meeting. The rain had deepened, soaking the gravel, turning the air sharp with petrichor and vineyard earth. He stopped near my car. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. I can't undo it. I looked at him, my heart softening despite everything. Then don't try to undo it, I said. Just stop defending it. Let the truth do what it needs to. He nodded, eyes lowered, and stepped back. For the first time in months, he didn't argue. By the time I reached home, the rain had turned heavy, drumming softly against the roof. I placed the new forensic report inside the cedar folder, beside the old documents. The paper was cold from the air, damp at the edges, but unbroken. I sat by the window, listening to the rain. The vineyard outside blurred under sheets of silver, the vines bowing but not breaking. I thought of Edward, how he taught me that storms prune what sunlight can't. Tonight, the storm was pruning again, stripping away everything false, leaving only what could endure. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of what might be left when it passed. The courthouse was overflowing that morning. Reporters crowded the marble steps, cameras flashing like a storm of artificial lightning. I walked through it quietly, holding the cedar folder against my chest, its smooth grain warm from my hands. Victor and Eddie flanked me like calm shadows, the kind that didn't need words to steady me. Inside, the air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that comes before thunder. Judge Dalton sat behind the bench, dignified, composed, and ready. Across the aisle, Sophia adjusted her blazer, pretending composure she didn't feel. Alessandro wasn't beside her this time. His name was now tied to a separate fraud investigation. Dan sat behind her, not with her. Alone, eyes fixed on the table, a ghost between two worlds. The clerk called the session to order. Victor rose, speaking clearly, his voice carrying through the room like calm truth cutting through fog. Your Honor, we are presenting forensic confirmation of document forgery, verified by 3 independent analysts. Additionally, we have the original ink tests, metadata trails, and transaction logs linking the defendants to coordinated fraud against Mrs. Hale. Judge Dalton nodded. Proceed. Eddie connected his laptop to the courtroom screen. Images appeared. Magnified ink streaks, mismatched timestamps, Sophia's emails, Alessandro's financial signatures. Evidence became its own narrative. Every click of the mouse was another revelation. Every pause, another reckoning. The defense tried to interrupt, arguing technicalities, procedural timing, anything to redirect the current. But the current had momentum now, and it was unstoppable. Then Marco Delaney, the wedding photographer, took the stand. He looked nervous but resolute, his hands clasped tightly. "I didn't mean to record it," he said, "but I did. And it's the truth." The courtroom watched as the video played. The image wasn't clear, but the sound was perfect. Sophia's voice, the same one I'd heard echo through the vineyard weeks earlier. "She'll sign, just wait. If she refuses, make her look ungrateful." Sophia's face hardened, then cracked. She shifted in her seat, whispering furiously to her lawyer. Her voice trembled when she spoke. That was taken out of context. But the context was already clear. Victor called Dan to the stand next. My son hesitated before walking forward, his footsteps slow, deliberate. His shoulders slumped as he took his oath. When he finally looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Humility without shame, sorrow without excuses. "Mr. Hale," Victor began, "do you recognize these documents?" Dan's eyes fell on the forged deed displayed on the screen. "Yes," he said softly. "I thought they were real. I thought I was signing something official, something my mother wanted." "Did your wife or her father ever tell you where those documents came from?" He hesitated. "They said it was already approved. They told me my mother had given consent. I didn't question it because I wanted to believe them." His voice cracked. "I wanted to believe I wasn't stealing from her." Victor gave a small nod. "And when you discovered otherwise?" Dan looked at me then, his voice shaking. I realized I'd already done the damage. Judge Dalton leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, are you aware of your rights in testifying against your spouse?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "And I still want to." The room fell silent. The only sound was the soft scratching of pens as reporters took notes. When Victor rested his case, the defense tried to salvage what they could, pleading confusion, misunderstanding, emotional manipulation. But even their arguments sounded tired, hollow. Finally, Judge Dalton removed his glasses and folded his hands. "This court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and forensic reports. It finds clear intent to defraud and coerce Mrs. Hale into relinquishing her property under false pretenses." He paused, glancing at Sophia, who sat frozen, eyes distant. "Therefore, the deed transfer is declared void. The vineyard remains the sole property of Mrs. Kate Hale. Additionally, the court recommends criminal prosecution for document forgery and elder financial abuse." His gavel came down once, hard and final. Sophia didn't move. Her lawyer began gathering papers, murmuring something about appeals. She stared at the table, her manicured hand trembling slightly. The image was almost poetic, grace collapsing under its own vanity. Dan turned toward me, tears brimming. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't deserve it, but I'm sorry." For a moment, the courtroom disappeared. It was just the two of us again. The mother who had once taught her son to tie his shoes, to prune vines without breaking them, to tell the truth even when it hurt. I wanted to tell him everything at once. That love doesn't vanish with betrayal, that forgiveness takes time, that I still believed he could find his way back. But all I said was, I know. When the hearing adjourned, the crowd outside erupted into noise. Microphones, cameras, the hum of public curiosity. I stepped into it with quiet steps. A reporter shouted, "Mrs. Hale, what does justice feel like?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the wind catching the edge of my coat. "It feels," I said, "like something my husband would have called pruning. Painful at first, but necessary for the next bloom." Victor joined me, handing back the cedar folder. "It's over," he said. I looked at the sunlight breaking through the clouds, the air clean again. "No," I said, softly. "It's just beginning." The weeks after the verdict moved slowly, like the world was catching its breath. Reporters eventually drifted away. The headlines faded, replaced by newer scandals, younger faces. But for me, time didn't move forward. It unfolded, quietly and deliberately, like the vines waking up after frost. Silvercrest stood untouched. No more flashing lights at the gate. No whispers in the market. No anonymous letters. Just wind and sunlight and the soft hum of bees returning to the lavender. I walked the rows every morning, boots pressing into damp soil, each step grounding me in something real again. Dan came by once a week, always unannounced. He never stayed long. He'd help repair a fence, fix the irrigation line, prune a few vines. Then he'd leave a bag of groceries by the porch, bread, coffee, the kind I liked, before driving off without asking for forgiveness. I never stopped him. Sometimes healing needs distance. Victor visited too, though less now that the legal storm had settled. "You could rest, Kate," he said one morning as he leaned against the porch railing. "You don't have to keep working this hard." "I'm not working," I said with a smile. "I'm replanting." He laughed softly. "Then maybe it's time you plant something beyond this land." That night, I took his words to heart. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my notebook, and began sketching an idea that had been growing quietly in me since the trial. A foundation for people like me, the ones who had been silenced by their own families, who had trusted too long and too deeply. I would call it the Hale Trust. I reached out to Marisol Vega, a woman I'd met years ago through the community center. She ran a nonprofit that helped widows navigate inheritance and elder protection cases. When she arrived at Silvercrest, we sat under the pergola with lemonade and stacks of notes. "What you're talking about," she said, eyes bright, "is more than charity. It's legacy." "I don't want my name to be a warning," I told her. "I want it to be a reminder that silence can also build." So we began. We turned the old storage barn into an office. We painted the walls white and hung Edward's compass by the door. Every folder, every case file that came in felt like another step toward peace. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low, Lucas came running down the driveway, his small backpack bouncing behind him. He was 7 now, full of that untamed energy only children carry. "Grandma," he shouted, holding up a folded paper. "I made you something." He handed me a crayon drawing. Me and him standing in the vineyard, vines taller than both of us. The sky full of lanterns. At the bottom, he'd written in wobbly letters, "Grandma's Vineyard, safe forever." I couldn't speak. I just pulled him close, the paper crinkling between us. It wasn't just a drawing. It was redemption in color. That evening, I placed the drawing inside the cedar folder, beside Edward's letter and the court decree. When I closed the clasp, it felt like the past and present had finally agreed to coexist. News came soon after. Sophia's assets were frozen, and her father's company was under federal investigation. There were talks of plea bargains, settlement whispers, and quiet disappearances. None of it brought me joy, just clarity. Some endings don't need applause. They only need to stop echoing. A week later, a man in a gray suit arrived at my gate with an envelope. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "A final settlement offer from Mr. Morante. Confidential." I opened it slowly. A check. Enough money to buy 3 vineyards. Attached was a typed note. "For peace, not defeat." I tore the check in half without a word. Then I handed the pieces back to the man. "Tell him peace isn't for sale." That night, I lit the porch lantern and sat under its glow. The vineyard stretched before me, quiet and endless, and for the first time, I didn't see it as something I had to protect. It was something I could finally share. A week later, the Hale Trust Foundation launched quietly. The first donation came from a retired teacher in Arizona who wrote, "I saw what they did to you. I almost lost my home to my son's greed too. Thank you for showing us another way." Letter by letter, story by story, they came. Widows, veterans, mothers, men too, each carrying their own scar. And for every letter I received, I planted a new row of lavender along the eastern fence. It became my ritual, my offering to the earth for its patience. On the evening the foundation reached its first 100 clients, I stood at the edge of the field, the air humming with crickets. The vines were heavy with grapes again, bending under the weight of renewal. I whispered to the wind, "You were right, Edward. Pruning isn't loss, it's grace." Then I walked back inside, the cedar folder resting on the table by the window, the lantern still burning. Its light flickered across Lucas's drawing, 2 figures in a field of gold, holding on, unbroken. The first time I saw Dan again, after the court ruling, really saw him. It wasn't at my house or the vineyard. It was at a construction site on the outskirts of town. Marisol had told me that one of the first Hale Trust projects involved restoring a small home for an elderly widow who'd lost her savings to a predatory loan. When I arrived to drop off supplies, I didn't expect to find my son there, hammer in hand, sweat streaking his shirt. He looked up as I stepped out of the truck, his eyes uncertain, as if I might disappear if he blinked too long. For a moment, we said nothing. The air between us was fragile, a thin glass of what used to be love, what might become forgiveness. "Marisol didn't tell me you'd be here," I said. "She didn't know I was coming," he replied, wiping his forehead. "I've been volunteering. Figured if I can't fix what I broke, maybe I can help someone else fix theirs." His voice was rough, honest. Not the tone of a man trying to be forgiven, but of one trying to understand what redemption actually meant. We worked side by side that afternoon, patching drywall, sanding trim, painting door frames. The woman whose home it was, Mrs. Kennedy, watched from her porch chair, her hands trembling slightly, but her smile unwavering. "I thought I'd die before I saw color on these walls again," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. When we were done, Dan stepped back, streaks of white paint across his jeans. His hands blistered from labor. He looked older, thinner, but grounded in a way I hadn't seen since before the wedding. "I've been thinking a lot," he said quietly, almost to himself, "about how everything fell apart. About how easy it was to listen to the wrong voice when I was scared. Fear makes good listeners of us all," I replied, setting down my brush. "It's what we do after fear that defines us." He nodded, glancing down at his hands. I can't undo what I did, Mom, but I don't want forgiveness unless I've earned it. I studied him for a long moment, then reached into my pocket. You once gave me something, I said, pulling out the small Polaroid I'd found weeks ago. You probably don't remember. He took it gently. It was the picture of him and Edward, father and son, barefoot in the soil, planting the first vines. His thumb brushed over the faint handwriting on the back. Our beginning. His roots will remember. Dan's shoulders shook. I remember, he whispered. He said roots don't run from storms. He was right, I said softly. And maybe this is your beginning again. We stood in silence, the smell of paint and fresh lumber mixing with the faint scent of lavender from the field beyond the fence. The sound of a child laughing floated on the wind, Lucas playing with Martisol's volunteers, his small hands clutching a toy tractor as he ran through the grass. Dan watched him for a long moment. He doesn't know everything, does he? No, I said. Just enough to understand that love is complicated and that people can change if they want to. Later, when the day ended, Mrs. Kennedy insisted on taking a photo with all of us. Her eyes shone as she held my hand. You didn't just rebuild my house, she said. You rebuilt something in me. As we packed up, Dan turned to me, his expression hesitant. I'd like to come by the vineyard next week, he said. Maybe help with the harvest, if that's okay. I took a breath, then nodded. The vines could use another pair of hands. He smiled, small, fragile, but real. That evening, back at Silvercrest, I walked through the vineyard as the sun melted into the hills. The grapes were heavy, ready to be picked. I brushed my fingers along the rows, feeling their quiet strength. At the end of the path, I found Lucas sitting on the ground, sketching with his crayons again. He held up his new drawing proudly. Look, Grandma, it's you and Daddy fixing the old lady's house. He said you helped too. I knelt beside him, touched the corner of the picture, and whispered, He's helping in more ways than one. When night fell, I lit the porch lantern and opened the cedar folder once more. Inside were all the symbols of our story. Edward's letter, the court decree, Lucas's first drawing, and now the photo from the day's rebuild. I placed it gently on top of the rest, closing the clasp with care. Forgiveness didn't come as thunder or tears. It came as quiet acknowledgement, a space left open between hurt and healing, wide enough for love to step back in if it chose to. As the lantern flickered, I looked out over the dark vineyard. Somewhere in that darkness, Dan was driving home, headlights tracing the same road he once took to leave me behind. Only this time, he was coming back. And I knew Edward would have smiled. By autumn, the vines had begun to yellow again, their leaves catching the last gold of the season. The harvest was over, the barrels sealed, and for the first time in years, Silvercrest felt peaceful. The vineyard no longer carried tension. It carried purpose. What had once been a battlefield had become a classroom of quiet lessons. Victor called one morning while I was labeling the last batch of bottles. His tone was lighter than usual. Kate, he said, you may want to sit down for this. I've been sitting for months, Victor. What now? He laughed. You've started a movement without realizing it. Judge Dalton reached out. He and a state assemblywoman are drafting something based on your case. They're calling it the Hale Clause. I set the label in my hand down slowly. After me? After what you stood for, he said. It's a proposed addition to the state's elder financial protection laws. Expedited review for any property transfer where coercion or psychological manipulation is suspected. It could change how these cases are handled. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The sound of the wind moving through the vines filled the silence. Edward would have loved this, I finally said. He'd have said you earned it, Victor replied. They're holding a small announcement ceremony next month. Nothing public, just lawmakers, advocates, and a few victims who'll benefit from it. They'd like you there. I agreed, though I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Recognition was never the goal. But as the weeks passed and the date approached, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about giving name to the fight so many others had been forced to wage in silence. When the day came, I wore Edward's brooch, polished and whole again. The event was held in a modest civic hall in Sacramento, the kind of place where change often begins quietly. Marisol was there, representing the Hale Trust. Victor stood at the edge of the room, the same cedar folder tucked under his arm as a symbol rather than a shield. Judge Dalton spoke first, his voice carrying calm authority. This clause was born not from conflict, but from conscience. It represents the idea that justice should be as accessible to the vulnerable as it is to the powerful. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Hale, you reminded this court that silence can defend as powerfully as speech. Your patience has turned into policy. There was polite applause, the kind that feels less like celebration and more like respect. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped to the podium and looked out at the faces before me. Lawyers, advocates, a few older women clutching folders of their own, each one holding a story they hadn't told yet. I don't have much to say, I began softly. Only that I didn't fight because I was brave. I fought because I was cornered. And sometimes, being cornered teaches you where your strength lives. If the Hale clause helps even one person find that strength before the corner closes in, then it's worth every sleepless night. When the ceremony ended, a young aide approached me with a small folder of her own. My mother's going through something similar, she said quietly. She's scared to speak up. Your story gave her courage. I placed a hand on hers. Then tell her silence isn't the same as surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of thinking. That evening, Victor and I drove back toward Silvercrest. The sky was turning amber, the kind of light that softens everything it touches. We didn't speak for a long time. The road curved between vineyards glowing with dusk. Do you ever wish it had all happened differently? Victor asked eventually. I thought about it. The slap, the shame, the trial, the sleepless nights. Then I shook my head. No, some vines only sweeten after they've been stressed. When we reached my gate, the sign for Silvercrest gleamed under the headlights. I stepped out of the car, touched the old wood, and whispered a thank you to the earth. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, writing letters for the foundation's next fundraising campaign. The cedar folder rested open beside me, filled not with fear anymore, but with history. The amendment, the court ruling, Lucas's drawings, the blueprint of the Hale clause. There was one more envelope among them, a plain one, unsigned, containing a single typed note. Corruption doesn't end with one trial. Keep watching. You started something bigger than you think. I read it twice, then placed it back into the folder. The words didn't frighten me. They steadied me. Because they were right. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a practice. Outside, the wind rustled through the lavender, bending but not breaking. The porch lantern flickered softly, casting gold against the cedar walls. I took one last look at Edward's compass on the shelf, its needle forever pointing home. The law had changed. The world was moving, And at last, the storm that had once swallowed my life had turned into light for others to follow. The evening light fell soft over Silvercrest, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness. The vineyard shimmered under a pale lavender sky, each row lined with the patience of a lifetime's work. The harvest was done, the barrel sealed, the hands washed clean. Only the hum of crickets and the faint breeze through the cedar trees remained. I walked the familiar path from the house to the porch, lantern in hand. I'd started lighting it every night again, a small ritual, a signal to myself that peace didn't have to be loud to be real. Lucas followed behind me, skipping on the gravel, his laughter cutting through the quiet like sunlight through clouds. "Grandma," he said, tugging on my sleeve, "why do you light that lantern every night? Grandpa's not lost, is he?" I smiled, kneeling beside him. "No, sweetheart, the lantern isn't for the lost. It's for the truth. Sometimes it needs a little help finding its way home." He nodded solemnly, the way children do when they think they understand something bigger than they can hold. "Can I light it tonight?" "Of course." He struck the match carefully, the flame catching slow, then steady. The lantern glowed warm, the glass reflecting his small face, his wide eyes. I watched him for a moment and thought of Dan at that age, running barefoot through these same rows, his laughter echoing just the same. Dan arrived a little later, carrying a small basket of grapes and a quiet smile. His eyes no longer held the weight of shame. They held gratitude. He'd been helping Marisol with the Hale Trust, handling logistics, even attending support groups for families torn by betrayal. Step by step, he was earning his place back in the light. "Mom," he said, handing me the basket. "Lucas helped pick these. He said they're for the lantern night." I took them, brushing his hand lightly. "They're perfect." We sat together on the porch as the sky deepened to violet. The lantern glowed between us, a silent witness. For a while, none of us spoke. The stillness didn't need filling. Then Dan said quietly, "I got a letter from Sophia." I turned to him, surprised but calm. "And?" "She's in Nevada. Some kind of plea deal for cooperation against her father. She said she's sorry for everything. Said she didn't expect me to forgive her, just that she wanted me to know she finally understands what she did." He handed me the letter, folded neatly in thirds. I opened it under the lantern light. The handwriting was small, careful, and full of restraint. "Mrs. Hale, I don't expect redemption, but I do wish you peace. What I destroyed was more than trust. It was legacy. I see that now. Thank you for not becoming like me." I read it twice, then folded it back carefully and placed it beside Edward's old compass on the table. "She's right about one thing," I said. "Peace isn't about revenge. It's about release." Dan nodded. "I think that's what I've been learning too." Lucas leaned his head against my arm, sleepy now. "Tell me the story again," he murmured. "The one about the vineyard." So I told him about how it started as nothing but a patch of dry land, how his grandfather worked through storms and heat, how every vine was planted with patience and watered with faith. I told him how sometimes the roots needed to be pruned, how cutting didn't mean ending. It meant giving something a chance to grow back stronger. When I finished, he was already asleep, his head resting in my lap. Dan stood to carry him inside, pausing at the door. "You kept it all together, Mom, even when everything fell apart." I shook my head. "No, I just stopped fighting what couldn't be fixed. The rest rebuilt itself." He smiled faintly and disappeared into the house, the door closing softly behind him. I stayed on the porch, the night deepening around me. The lantern flickered, its light swaying gently against the lavender that lined the fence. The air smelled of earth and salt from the distant sea. I took out Edward's letter one last time, the one he'd left years ago, the one that began all of this. The paper had yellowed slightly, but his handwriting was still strong, still sure. If they ever make you doubt yourself, remember who you are. I folded it back, placed it beside the brooch, the compass, and Sophia's letter. Then I closed the cedar folder for the final time. For a while, I just sat there, listening to the quiet rhythm of the world returning to itself. Somewhere out in the dark, a nightbird called. The vines rustled softly, the lantern glow stretching into the rose like a thin thread of gold. I whispered into the night, to Edward, to the land, to the echoes of everything that had been lost and found again. I kept the light on, not for them, but so the truth could find its way home. And for the first time in years, I felt no weight at all, only the calm certainty of a life reclaimed, a legacy restored, and love, finally, at peace beneath the lavender sky.